What kind of day is it, Daniel?
Today is a great day, Dan.
As always, Daniel. Glad to hear it. So, what are we talking about today?
Today I'd like to talk about how politics influence the stock market, what the deal with tariffs and all the news there is, and permanently relocating to another country.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it.
Oh boy. Politics. Why would you do this to me?
I did this to you because it seems to be a conversation we're having with a lot of folks recently. Um, my politics aside, people have a lot of concerns, and those concerns tend to, at least in their mind, uh, influence what's going on in the stock market, and the two go tandem with each other. And there's a lot of angst that maybe this time things are different. Uh, Markets have been a little choppy lately, and we've gotten some calls, emails from clients asking how this impacts their long-term plan and what this means for the stock market. So first and foremost, starting to talk about this conversation a little bit, does the political landscape impact the market?
Yes and no, but I'm going to call attention to the fact that you said the magic words, right? The four most dangerous words in all of investing are this time it's different. And so, in that context, I'm just going to give some context for listeners who may or may not be as familiar. We're a certified B Corp. We're in Boulder County, Colorado. Boulder County, Colorado voted like 82% Democrat during the election in the most recent electoral cycle. I think it probably gives you some idea of the tone and tenor and cause for the conversations we're having that's leading to this question. So I'm just going to put that context out there. Succinct answer, though, to your, do politics affect the market? Yes and no. Yes, it affects the market. No, it doesn't really affect the market in a significant sense. But it does on a micro level in a strange way. So, when I say that, the big thing to keep in mind is that the market is a mechanism for the forward looking expectations in the aggregate of all of its participants, right? The value of everything you can buy and sell in the market is based upon the warranted belief that that thing is fairly priced, and that if we're buying it, we think that it's fairly priced and could improve in price or improve in value. And if we're selling it, that we need cash or liquidity or whatever it is, or we're disposing of this asset because we don't have the same optimism going forward. And the machinations of the market, whether it goes up or down, whether the news has green letters or red letters, is largely a reflection of that day's market sentiment in the aggregate of how many people are on the yes side of the proposition or the no side of the proposition, and consequently how much the market is being pushed up and down.
Okay, and for every sell, right? So in those days where the market is performing poorly and there's a lot of red, there's also a buyer on the other side of that transaction that is optimistic for the long-term outlook of the market, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of expressions on this, right? Warren Buffett, be greedy when others are fearful, and be fearful when others are greedy. Your panic is my opportunity. I mean, there's all sorts of things like that. Where at the end of the day, that's sort of the framing that I come into this political conversation with. There's the whole this time it's different problem, because I can just go back in my own life of political awareness, right? I sort of came of age at a time when a lot of people were talking about Bush as if he was the devil. And then we went on to the Obama election, and you had people talking about Obama as if he was a terrorist and a Muslim and all sorts of things, and he was going to ruin America. And then we had another Obama election, and it was the last chance to save America from these crazy liberal woke ideas. And then the next election, of course, we weren't going to elect some billionaire real estate guy, and then suddenly we elected some billionaire real estate guy, right? And so every election cycle, you can see it in the data. Everybody's disposition about current events flip flops aggressively based on their political priors, right? So when a Democrat is in office and a Republican is not in office, Democrats tend to think that the economy is good, the market is good, the positive and outlook for the country is good. And then when the election happens and a Republican takes office, suddenly all the Democrats, run screaming for the hills, and suddenly everything is terrible and awful, and the economy is terrible, and we're all doomed. And suddenly all the Republicans who just spent the last 4 years, the last 8 years being really upset and concerned about the state state of the country and thinking we're heading in the wrong direction suddenly just thinks everything is hunky-dory. And that's not like my political opinion. That's a data driven observation. You can see market sentiment, consumer sentiment, buying behavior, all this stuff heavily is influenced by our political priors. And I think the basic explanation for that is we tend to consume information that agrees with us, right? We have cognitive dissonance when people disagree with us. And so we go for a confirmation bias thing, consume a lot of media that favors our outlook on the world. And consequently, then when we think about like, oh, things are so terrible right now, or things have never been better right now, that's largely a byproduct of the media we're consuming on a regular basis, the sources of information we get our news and kind of form our opinions from. And then, in light of that, when we think about something like, stock market conditions, we don't have any conservative people calling us concerned right now. But I had a lot of people coming up to the election who are conservative, who are worried that Trump was going to lose, talking to me about getting into gold or cash or something, because what if Biden wins again, or what if Kamala Harris wins again, and now things are going to go off a cliff and they're going to ruin the world. And none of those people seem really concerned anymore, right? They all seem pretty darn happy with the state of things. So like, that's the thing that I want to highlight here is, at least in the macro sense, the market actually doesn't care who's in office. The participants in the market care who's in office, and in the aggregate, sometimes they push the market down by overselling because they're panicking, or they push the market up because whether it's the same people who are panicking before changing their mind, or whether it's because the greed of people taking advantage of those people panicking is kicking in, sufficient to change the direction of the tide.
The buying when others are fearful, or being fearful when others are greedy quote you had there is interesting. As you said, there's a portion of our clients that currently we'd say are more concerned than others. And conversely, when the political landscape shifts, it tends to be the opposite section of clients. If that's true, it's very easy for us, with our confirmation bias being historical events and our expertise in the industry, to tell people to stay the course and, not change anything or make drastic changes. But there's also a little subsection of clients that really, either one way or another, their political affiliations aside, tend to not worry and understand and are on that same page with us. Why is that, and what are they maybe doing differently, and what can we learn from them, during times like this?
I think the easiest analogy for those people is they're passengers on the plane and they know that they're not flying. And so they just rely on the plane to get them where they're going, and the pilots and the crew to do their jobs. In this particular analogy, right, the market is the plane and the crew is us, right, as their investment managers, as their financial planners, or the fund managers of the various products that they own and so on. They recognize that they can throw a fit and they can make a big scene and they can try to get off the proverbial plane here and so on. But at the end of the day, their best outcome is if they just sit it out and let it happen, whether they think it's a good thing or a bad thing, whether turbulence is happening or not, whatever the case is, right? They're indifferent to the current goings on. There's sort of an interesting analog to this, which is there are always these stories about people out there who like don't have TV, don't have the internet, don't get the newspaper, who just like decided to tune out current events, and when they're studied and researched, they're some of the happiest people on earth. And that's not to say that what's going on right now, or at any time in the future, or any time in the past, that current events aren't important, that geopolitical things aren't important, government policies aren't important. There are real things that happen in the real world as a byproduct of various policies, regulations, programs, and so on, that have real world effects on people. But in light of how we think about like what to do about it, you shouldn't be doing anything with your portfolio because something happened. You should be doing something with your portfolio as a byproduct of your decision to make a strategic change in the orientation of your long-term objectives. So if you're like, hey, I'm 5 years from retirement, I think I probably want to start de-risking because I'm going to retire soon. That makes sense. It makes sense to say, I'm going to take my risk down a little bit. But if your thought here is, I'm going to sell out and go to cash and then buy gold and I'm going to bury it in my backyard because I'm really worried about something that I read about in the news, pardon my French, but chill the fuck out. Like there's real world things that are happening to real people. If you have green card issues or citizenship issues, if you have friends, family who are immigrants, whether legal or undocumented, if you are a person with a green business or who is in the renewable sector, like there's plenty of current events that you could be personally concerned about. But if your concern is, well, I read something in the news and I think that's the reason that the stock market's going to fall off a cliff, get over yourself. The market does not care about anything that much. And so, there are sometimes big red scary number days where the market goes down 2, 3, 4%. Guess what? That actually happens every year. We just tend to forget about it, right? And the cause is almost always forgettable. I cannot actually tell you, really, I think, other than COVID and Brexit, an explanation for why there's been a big red scary number day at all in the last decade. But I know that they've happened several dozen times. And in turn, there's been plenty of big green happy number days. And I also, for the life of me, cannot actually explain why any of them happened, because it turns out it just doesn't really matter. The market is a short term, what have you done for me lately sentiment machine. And in that sense, right, what's good is today is bad tomorrow. What's bad yesterday is good today, right? A lot of the times when you compare best day in the market, worst day in the market in any particular year, the days are right next to each other. The market drops out one day and then it recovers the next day, or it spikes one day out of enthusiasm, and then people kind of get over the enthusiasm and sell out, and it causes the market to drop a little bit. But like this idea that we're going to race around and solve problems, it just doesn't make any sense. At the end of the day, there's a Venn diagram, and the basic overlap is there's stuff that matters and there's stuff we can control. We can control what our portfolio does, but it has no impact on what matters. And what's happening right now matters for a lot of people, but doing stuff to your portfolio doesn't overlap with impacting that. And so at the end of the day, we should focus on the things that matter and the things we can control. In your portfolio and current events essentially have almost no relationship there.
Let's say the market does drop, whether it's 5, 10, 15% on a week basis. Are there any opportunities or things we may start to do with families, whether it's tax loss harvesting or starting to evaluate Roth conversions, that we take a look at? And would you say, if so, that there are benchmarks, whether it's a certain percentage point, in which case we do start to look into those things more deeply?
I think there's individualized benchmarks, and I say that because if I start saying right now, if it goes down more than 10%, that's the time to do it. Somebody here is going to immediately go look at their portfolio and start doing stuff, and I don't want you to do that. Where I'll say here is, if the market's down more than 5 or 10%, that becomes a really good triggering event for us to really start taking more ongoing due diligence on our client portfolios and accounts to go ahead and keep a closer eye. Right when things are going up, you're not going to find a lot of tax loss harvesting opportunities. When things are going up, you're not going to find really great timing for a Roth conversion or anything like that. But on the other side of that, if things go down, the more they go down, the more that activity starts to take up our time and our attention, because those opportunities may present themselves in sort of small windows. But none of that activity is going to drive us to do something like call up all our clients and say, hey, today you're at 80-20, we think you should go to 70-30. That's never going to be the output. But you named some of the things, right? Tax loss harvesting, Roth conversions. There's certain things that are more opportune to do based on how the things are measured when the market is down. And for the rest of everybody who's just sort of on autopilot, you're showing up at your 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, contributing to your 401k, congratulations, there's a sale going on, enjoy it. And if you're in the retiree camp and you're concerned about your portfolio going down and your life savings declining a little bit, this is why you want to have decent amounts of cash buffers on hand, right? Or secure assets where you can pause distributions for a little while, so you're not selling things on sale, and just live on that sort of reserve that you have in place, or utilizing things like reverse mortgages or various other mechanisms to go ahead and make up the difference for a short period of time.
Stay the course.
Well, it's stay the course because, again, back to the pilot analogy and the plane analogy, right? You are a passenger in the market. Everybody's a passenger. I get to call myself a pilot in this context because other people have put me in charge of their assets or in their position. But even for my own investments, I'm a passenger there, even though I'm technically flying the plane, and I'm doing the exact same thing that I'm doing for every client, which is I'm not freaking out. We're staying invested. We're investing more if we're at that phase of life where that makes sense. And we're in a storm, and you sail into that storm on the particular ship or plane that you boarded in the first place. It's going to get you to your destination as long as you don't jump overboard.
I liked the blog you had the other day for a shameless plug here, where you said you're in a bunker and there's shells and bullets flying all over the place and everyone's panicking. They look at you and you're just sitting there, and they say, Dan, why aren't you panicking? And you say, oh, you must be new here. This happens all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sad reality is that everybody who's listening to this, everybody who's our client, you've been through something like this a bunch of times. Some of you have been through this dozens of times, right? If you're up there in years. And for some reason, for regardless of who you are, where you are, etc., some of us just have higher trait neuroticism in the big five ocean traits sort of sense, and that means we feel negative emotions more strongly than others. But I'll tell you, my answer to every client who's ever called for any reason at any time about like, is this a reason to panic? Should we do something? The answer has always been no, and it turns out that has 100% of the time been the correct answer.
You mentioned how there are real things in the political landscape and current events that do impact the market or do impact individuals and families in real time. One of which being legislation around tariffs. Uh, Before we even get into the conversation, for me and the audience, can you explain exactly what is going on and what these tariffs are?
Yeah, so I mean, really, basically, a tariff is a tax on a foreign imported good. So essentially, a company wants to bring in, let's say, lumber. We say, hey, there's a tariff from your country on lumber from your country, and it's 20%. So if you're bringing in, let's say, $100,000 worth of lumber, and there's a 20% tariff, then you are going to need to pay us $20,000 in taxes to go ahead and cover that tariff. And so the company will pay that, the importing company will pay that tariff, but that then means they're going to need to bake 20% more into the price of that commodity or that good or that service, whatever they're importing, to go ahead and cover that cost, which then drives the price of that thing up in the general market. Now, the idea behind tariffs then is that domestic local companies don't have to pay that, and that makes them more competitive in the marketplace because they don't have to increase their pricing by that percentage. But often a lot of tariffs apply to commodities that we are dependent on foreign imports for. And so ultimately, though the company, the importer, technically pays the actual direct tax, we all as consumers then pay higher prices at the store or from the vendor or whatever it is for those various goods or commodities because they have to bake those prices in to recoup the tax cost.
Maybe this is an interesting or not really a great question, but we don't try to time the market per se. However, in light of some of the recent news around tariffs, are there certain purchases or should we time certain purchases at opportune times because of legislation like tariffs?
I think the nasty thing about that is it is a lot like market timing. It's a really good analogy because I can make just as good an argument for why a tariff should go up as I could for it to go down. And it's going to come down to political whim. It's going to come down to the personalities of the leaders of the respective countries. It's going to depend on foreign policy objectives, domestic policy objectives, etc. And so in that context, the problem with trying to time tariffs is you can be like, oh, the tariffs are really high. So let's say that gaming PC I wanted to buy from China, or it's going to be built in China, is going to cost me like an extra $1,000 because there's an import tariff on tech from China. Well, I'm just going to hope that it goes away. That's all you can do is you're going to wait on buying your new gaming PC, hoping that the tariff on China is going to go away or go down at some point. But there's plenty of reasons that it could go up more. So to some extent, I don't really advocate trying to market time around tariffs just because if you have a necessity, you have a necessity. If it's a luxury good, it's an imported car and we just slapped a 20% tariff on the country manufacturing the car or something, you might want to hold out just because that tariff is literally potentially costing you thousands or tens of thousands of dollars more, depending on how serious it is. But on the other hand, you could just look for a different kind of car, right? Or a different source for that gaming PC or a different provider for that lumber or that steel or whatever it is you're trying to buy. I'm just not a big fan of waiting around on it because you're just hoping. It's sort of like people who wait to buy a house and they're waiting for prices to go down. It's like, you can hope that they go down, but there's just not a lot of pressure to make them go down. There's certain localities where they go down a little bit every year, but like you're going to sit around here in Boulder County and hope that prices are going to go down by what, 10, 15, 20% before you buy. Like, good luck. I hope it happens for you. That'd be nice, but I don't think it's a good strategy because you're relying on something you can't control to affect the outcome, and you're not focusing on what you have power over in that particular context.
It goes back to the Venn diagram that I have in my head and that you described earlier. There's things we can control and there's things we should worry about, and we should really focus on the things that are within our control and focus on changing those things. There was a gentleman in the gym the other day who was talking about buying 100 crates of luxury wine from France because I guess they were going to slap a tariff on it, and he couldn't get the purchase because he genuinely wanted the wine, but they wouldn't sell him that much. They thought he'd be reselling it. So, as a luxury good, would you recommend something like that if you had the arbitrage opportunity?
I would recommend that that gentleman find a great appreciation for bourbon produced here in Colorado as an offset, or Kentucky if you want the original.
I'll try to convince him.
Well, and I mean, here's the thing. Like, part of this tariff thing is that there's a lot of volatility around it. I was talking to Dave Farrow with 303 Sign Company here in Longmont last week, and he was just talking about how an aluminum provider, right? He builds signs like the big monument signs, or like glowing light signs, or whatever that you have on buildings. Right, and he was talking about how an aluminum provider was literally not able to quote more than 24 hours in advance for any project or order because aluminum prices are not only all over the place, but also because the tariff thing is just making it crazy. So part of this also is, like you can try to wait it out and you might think of that as a long term thing, but depending on exactly what you're trying to buy, like it might change by an enormous amount day to day. And at some point, you just got to make your commitment to say, look, I'm just going to buy it, come hell or high water, and the price is what the price is.
That being said, would you tend to recommend or say it's better to be the person who listens to no media and statistically might be a little happier? Or would you say it is worth keeping a pulse on what is going on in regard to some of these current events like tariffs?
For financial purposes, I think the smartest thing you can do is to never ever read the news or pay attention because, again, back to what we just talked about for the couple of minutes there, you just don't have any influence on what's going to happen there and it doesn't matter. I do think there's a reasonable case where you have to say, back to being maybe one of those more vulnerable individuals, right, with foreign national family members, or you live in a sort of politically targeted industry, or, part of your particular company or something. There's maybe reasons to stay current on current events, but not for financial reasons.
I like it. Thanks. So, last last topic here. Relocating to another country, whether for politically charged reasons or maybe it's personal interest, either during working years or in retirement, families and individuals come to us and say they want to relocate. At least in my experience practicing thus far and through witnessing other planners, it seems to be one of those things that's more a nice idea and less practical and happens less in reality. Uh, would you say that's true as well?
I think it happens less in reality because when the rubber meets the road, people realize how complex it is. And I think here's a good example, right? We get a healthy number of people who talk about like maybe we'll like buy a beach house in Mexico. You're like, okay, like that's perfectly fine. There's a whole bunch of regulatory questions that go into buying something like a beach house in Mexico. Are you a citizen versus a resident? Or are you on a temporary visa? Are you legally allowed to buy there? Can you only rent there? Like, there's a whole bunch of logistics things that just go into that. But in more broad strokes, the element of going overseas is always going to be a country by country problem you have to solve because every country does or does not have sort of established rules and guidelines for what it takes to move from the United States specifically to that other country. Some countries have a universal set of rules. Some countries would love for Americans to move there. Some don't want any Americans to move there. Sometimes it's job and labor skill set. Sometimes it's wealth built or based. You have golden visa programs in some countries where you can essentially get permanent residency or even citizenship by bringing enough money to the country. So there's all sorts of stuff like that that plays into it. I think if you want to go overseas for a year or two just because you want to live in New Zealand, you want to live in the UK or something, and you find a path to do that, that's perfectly fine. But there's a really, really big financial difference between temporarily living somewhere and sort of leaving your financial assets here and actually genuinely relocating your entire life to a different country. Those are two very different things.
Well, I think one of the points you've brought up before, whether it's a vacation home, a second residence, or relocating fully, one of the more overlooked things that's wise, or even relocating in retirement, is spending a prolonged period of time there, more than 2 weeks, right? So 2 months, 4 months, 6 months. You might very well find out you don't like eating fish all day, or it's too difficult for you to pick up the second language, or a slew of other factors. And I don't think that's something a lot of people consider. I think they like to close their eyes and say, "I'm on the beach in Italy," or I'm in the farmland and I'm stomping on grapes making wine all day, but they really don't think about what the remainder of that day looks like and what a day-to-day life looks like when maybe they don't have AC or they don't have any friends or a social network in this new country, or even more financial things like where you move and how far a US dollar may stretch if you decide to move? Are those even conversations we get into, or would you more, discuss the lifestyle things first to make sure it's a good fit?
I think lifestyle first and foremost, just because people have this romantic image of what it is to be overseas. Um, and I think in practice, spend anywhere long enough, and the sort of the glistening sheen will wear off, right? Like we live here in Colorado, we've got mountains, we've got beautiful, like rivers and gorges and climbing and skiing, and we've got great sunsets over the mountains, yada yada yada. But there's a difference between being a tourist here and actually living here, right? Living at altitude, living in a dry climate, versus, let's say, going to Miami. Lots of people move to Miami, but like, what is it like to live in a place that gets absolutely smashed by a hurricane a couple times a year? What is it like to live somewhere with essentially 100% humidity year round? What is it like to live somewhere with a really big ethnic population that you may or may not be comfortable or familiar with, right? And let alone moving to a different country that doesn't have a culture so similar to yours. Like, it's one thing to move to the UK, it's one thing to move to Canada, right, where there's a lot of similarities, but move to somewhere like Thailand, where not only do a ton of people not speak English, but also you now are probably going to be in a racial minority if you're at least coming from the United States. You're not speaking the native language. There's cultural differences. There's all sorts of different things there. And again, like, it's fun to dabble and sort of sample those things a couple weeks at a time. But it's exactly what you called out. There's a big difference between doing it for a week or two and spending 12 months there and really actually getting ingrained and being a resident of that place. So cultural and experiential is a big part of it. Financial then sometimes is just a make or break factor. Like, hey, there's certain parts of the world where it's much more affordable to live, and so your dollar will go further there, and that's beneficial. But there is no free lunch. There's going to be trade-offs that come with that.
It's a great point. It's like, before I started this job, I came out here in February for about a week, and living here has been completely worse. All jokes, but there is a big difference. In my head, when I come out here in February, it's like, great, I'm gonna bathe in the sun all day and go hiking every weekend, and life is going to be so bliss. But the reality of life is, after a while, everything sort of settles in. Whether it's the new raise, the new job, the new girlfriend, after a while, you still are yourself, and your circumstances still are your circumstances. And whether I'm in New Jersey or Colorado, I still am Daniel. And more days, every day just looks the same after a while, whether I'm here or somewhere else. That said, I do love Colorado.
Well, it's a great place to be, but also if you keep studying for your CFP as hard as you are, you're going to be as pale as I am by the time you're done.
Not entirely the goal. I also would like to have a little bit more hair if possible.
Well, that's a whole different question than just not getting enough sunshine. But yeah, I don't blame you there either. And I think ultimately, if somebody wants to live overseas, I think you should want to live overseas anyway. Right? You should have a deep love and passion for France or for Mexico or Costa Rica or wherever it is that you're thinking about locating to. You should spend a lot of time there in the first place. And if it's a big ambition for you, if you'd really genuinely love to live there and be there, that's awesome, and that's worth exploring and considering. That's part of living your one great life. But on the other side of that, back to the conversation we had about tariffs and about politics affecting the market and so on, if it's just like a panic, I don't want to be here anymore reaction, I think it's a lot of pain to go through to try to actually uproot your entire life to live overseas long term. And again, let alone getting into the factors of getting a new citizenship, revoking US citizenship if that's what you intend to do, international taxation, foreign asset reporting. There's just a lot that goes into it, and it's not for the faint of heart.
Not to mention, if you're a current client, it might make it more difficult for you to work with us.
No, I'll follow anybody anywhere they go. That's the great joy of my life, is trying to help people live their great life. But honestly, if you do move to a country that I know nothing about and can't help you with, then all I'm going to be able to do there is try to find you a great CFP wherever you may travel to. But we'll miss you.
Sweet. Thanks, Dan.
Sure thing. Well, since you're queuing me up so very well for it, you know what I've got to ask right now.
What's funny is, about 3 minutes ago, I realized I actually didn't have an answer for it this week. So I was thinking about it for the last 15 seconds or so. But I have something pretty good here. If somebody's looking for a planner, it's more table stakes to make sure they're knowledgeable and an expert and familiar with your situation and other important factors, trust and the way they present themselves and really how you feel around them. I think one of the most important things is to look for somebody who communicates in a way that you understand and in a way that gets you to take forward action. And on the flip side, looking toward being a professional and developing in this career, one of the most important skills that I can hone in and continue to develop is my ability to not only communicate effectively, but communicate in a way that gets the person across or sitting next to me to take action and, continue forward momentum toward long-term and short-term goals here.
I think it's absolutely true. Emily talked last week about who needs a financial planner, and I made the point, like, look, there's a financial planner for everybody. Technical competency is table stakes, but sometimes it's not the right business model or the right service set. But the other part here is just communication and professionalism and relationship. Most financial planners work lifelong with their clients, and so in that particular regard, if you don't like your financial planner, you don't really click with your financial planner, it's okay to find a financial planner that you do click with.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.